Again, in this lesson, we are talking about percents. And remember, when it says use the definition of the word percent, that means our definition basically is just per hundred. Percent means per hundred. So let's use that to write each percent as a fraction and then as a decimal. So if we have 37.5%, that means per hundred. So this is 37.5 per hundred. Now, we don't like to leave a decimal inside a fraction. When we do ratios, we can, but these are fractions. So I am going to move the decimal point 1 to the right, but that means I have to take the decimal point that's right here and move it to 1 to the right as well. So that ends up being 375 per 1,000. Now, I'll be the first to admit I'm really bad at this. I would say this is 375 over 1,000, but it's actually 375 thousandths. So if we say it correctly, it kind of gives us our answer as a decimal. 375 thousandths. That 5 there is in the thousandths. TH place. Okay? So again, when you say it correctly, it kind of helps you out. 100%. 100 per 100. Percent per 100. So, well, what's 100 divided by 100? 1 over 1. So as a fraction, you can write it's just 1 over 1 if you wanted to. You should reduce these. I'm not going to put the focus on that right now because I just want to make sure we're getting it into the correct fraction, and then later we'll worry about reducing. Well, as a decimal, what's 1 divided by 1? 1. All right, so 110%. 110 per 100. Okay, and again, you could divide these, but we'll just be good with that right now. Now, notice this is over, right? Like 100 out of 100 is 1, and that's 10 over. So this is actually, and if you made this into a mixed number, you would say 100 goes into 110 one time, and there's 10 hundredths left over. 1 and 10 hundredths. Okay, and honestly, we don't even need this 0 here. If you had it, that's fine. Okay, again, I want our focus into be putting these into the correct fraction and decimal form. All right, 1 per 100. 1 per 100. Okay? I don't know why I'm struggling with that second 0 so much. So that's 1/100th. 1/100th. Now be careful. Don't just put a 1 right here. Remember, that's tenths, hundredths. You got to put that 1/100th in the correct spot, the 100th spot. All right, then we have 0.5%. Half per 100. Half per 100. I'm going to change 1/2. 1 divided by 2 is 0.5, so that's actually like saying 0.5 out of 100. And then I'm going to use that trick I used up here. I want to move it 1 to the right, so I'm going to add a decimal point here and move that 1 to the right. And we end up with 5 thousandths. Okay, and again, remember to change it to a decimal if you say it correctly, 5 thousandths. This is the tenths, hundredths, thousandths spot. The 5 has to go there. So that's 5 thousandths. Okay, now I want to kind of give you an example of a couple others you might see and some tricks that we're going to work on later, but I want to introduce them to you right now. What if I had like what if I had like 3/10? All right, a couple different ways we could do that. Okay, that's a fraction. All right, if I wanted to change it to a decimal, I could actually multiply both the top and bottom by 10. Here's what I mean. If I multiply this by 10, that gives me per 100. If I multiply this by 10, because remember, whatever you do the bottom, you gotta do the top, that gives me 30. All right, now it's per 100, and I could write this as 30 per 100, 30%. Okay, another thing, so if you can get it out of 100, then it's easy to change it to a decimal. Okay, something else we're gonna start working on is, let's say we had something out of 8. Now there's nothing I can just multiply 8 by to give me 100. So what you can do is you can divide. This right here, you've heard me say it a bunch of times, is the division bar. Fraction bar is a division bar. So this is actually 1 divided by 8. So if you were to grab a calculator and go 1 divided by 8, that would be 0.125. That's great, except that's, and actually I should go back here. Remember, this is 30. The decimal, I realized I didn't put that as decimal, sorry. 30 hundredths, 30 hundredths, 30%. Okay, sorry, back over here. Now for this one here, remember a percent is per hundred, right? So what we're actually doing is we're moving the decimal point 2 places to the right. When you go from a decimal to a fraction, you move the decimal point 2 places to the right. And I'm just going to introduce you to that, and we'll spend more time later with that. That's just how you change decimals into fractions. So if you have decimals into percent. So if you have a fraction and you can't get it out of 100, you can always divide. 1 divided by 8 is 0.125, okay? I want to make it into a percent, so I got to move my decimal place over 2 times. Tenths, hundredths, move it over twice. Now don't just think of it as moving it to the 100 spot, but you're moving it over 2 times because it's like you're multiplying by that 100, okay? So if you multiply by 100, you move it over 2 times. That's why it's 12.5%. 12.5 per 100. And we'll spend more time with that. Okay. Now, if you go the other way though, so if I'm going from decimal to percent, 2 to the right, but what if I have a percent and need to make it into a decimal? Okay. Find your decimal point. If it's not listed, comes at the end. If you're going for percent to decimal, you got to move it 2 places to the left. So 37% is 37 hundredths, right? So you don't necessarily need the intermediate step of a fraction. You could, right? 37 per 100, 37 hundredths, tenths, hundredths. You can see how these would be equal. You can go back and forth between them. We don't need the fraction though if we understand that to go from percent to a decimal, we move it to the left. So another example, let's say I had 125%. Decimal point right here, I move it 2 places left, and that would be 1.25. Drop the percent sign. It's no longer percent, okay? But what if we had a number with a decimal point in it? 174.3%. And the last two, we had to add the decimal point in. We got one right here. So go where the decimal point is and move it 2 to the left. Percent to decimal, 2 to the left, drop the percent sign. Okay, and we'll spend more time with that. Just want to introduce you to that. All right, so let's go one more example really similar to what you're going to be doing in some of your homework problems. We need to convert between these three, okay? There is no order that says you have to go one, this step right to decimal to fraction. You can go wherever, okay? So 350%. Okay, so I might jump to a fraction. 350 per 100. Now, if I'm working on reducing, I'm going to get rid of, divide both the zeros out, right? And then I'm going to say, well, 10 goes into 35 3 times, and that's 5/10 left over. Or, I know I'm scooting over here, 3.5, because 5/10 equals a half. All right? Now, it's easy for me, in this case, to go from fraction to decimal, 3.5. 3.5. But if I didn't know that, I can always go 1 divided by 2. Okay? Sorry, went out of the lines there a little bit. All right, so now this one, notice it's 0.025. Okay? Now, this is tenths, hundredths. This is the thousandth spot right there. So this actually works out to be 25 thousandths. Again, if you say it correctly, it gives you your answer. Okay? And again, this is not going to be a big stressor, but if you were to divide both top and bottom by 25, just for the sake of time, I'll tell you that's what we're dividing by. You would get 1/40th. Okay? Now, as a percent, remember if we go from decimal to percent, you move the decimal point 2 places to the right. 2.5%. 2.5 per 100. All right, and this last one, remember, this just means 1 divided by 8. Type it into a calculator and you get your answer, 0.0125. Now, if I want to make this as percent, remember I take my decimal point 2 to the right, and that's 12.5%. I should show you real quick. This 350 right here. Remember, if I wanted to go from percent to decimal, I would take my decimal point and move it 2 to the left. Sorry, 2 to the left, which is why it's 3.5. Works that way as well. Okay, so this is kind of similar to what you're doing on your homework. All right, so percent, okay? Percent means per hundred. There's 3 ways of writing a number: percent, a fraction, or decimal. And remember that percent means part out of 100. Okay, so when we write it like we did here, percent, fraction, decimal, these are all equal or equivalent ways of writing the same number.